So last discussion we had was about how different states, democracies versus authoritarian regimes, can have multiple different actors involved or fewer actors involved in policymaking. But I think it's also worth spending some time thinking about sort of the bureaucratic structures of states and how that can affect what states are able to do and how that looks. And so I think it's worth keeping in mind that states are incredibly complex structures, right? And that it's not just the leader that sort of makes decisions and carries those decisions out. If a leader is sort of standing in his or her office and sort of barking out orders and the room is empty, nothing happens. Leaders aren't magical. They can't sort of make their will sort of translate through the system. In order for a leader's sort of decision to translate its way down, somebody has to sort of take that order, pass it through, recognizable channels, whether that's an executive order or whether that's, a verbal statement passed down from a superior. It has to work its way down through a chain of command in which people are accountable, in which people respond and do what they're told, all the way to sort of the street level, where a bureaucrat or a soldier or an official has to change what he or she is doing in response to that command. And so in order for leaders to be effective, leaders have to have a bureaucracy that can allow them to implement decisions. It needs to be able to function. It needs to have some sort of chain of command. And in states where that is in place and functions, it can be easy to forget about it. It can oftentimes be easy to think about it as almost mechanical, like the bureaucracy is a machinery. And while that's maybe a useful assumption when things work, as social scientists, we know that human beings are complex and human systems are messy and things don't always work. And so I'll just sort of flag this graphic really briefly. This is the Corruption Perception Index. This is a measure that's collected by an organization called Transparency International, which looks at levels of corruption across different countries, and they sort of score things. And so the green is better and the red is worse, and sort of orange and yellow kind of are in the middle. But it gives you sort of a sense of where we see government bureaucracies that more or less function, more or less do what they're supposed to do, in which bureaucrats are more or less acting in the public good, following the rule of law rather than siphoning off resources for their own benefit or the benefit of their families. And this is worth keeping in mind when we're thinking about the functioning of other countries and whether or not they're able to actually implement policy, right? So if the United States is telling Afghanistan to help crack down on the Taliban or control the flow of opium and poppy fields, well, that might all be well and good, but if Afghanistan doesn't have the bureaucratic infrastructure to be able to control its territory, to be able to implement policy, there's not much to be done. Likewise, if a state is going to be able to give foreign aid effectively, it needs some sort of apparatus to be able to dole that money out. And not every state has a functioning apparatus that can dole money out in a way that is relatively free of graft. So again, when bureaucracies work, we sometimes forget about them and assume they operate like machines, but we shouldn't assume that they work, and that we shouldn't assume that they work everywhere. Nor should we assume that bureaucracies are always simply just responding to the will of the leader. I would point out that bureaucrats as individuals respond less to the will of the leader and much more to the incentives of the system that they are embedded in, right? And so if you are a mid-level bureaucrat in the State Department or the CIA or the Department of Defense, you're less concerned about what the president is saying or doing, what U.S. policy is, then you're concerned about what's going to get you a good rating on your next performance eval. And that might be doing exactly what the president has asked to be done, or it might not, depending upon the organization, depending on how the organization is set up, depending on the messages that are coming down. And I'll give you sort of a quick example that I think is useful and intuitive and really sort of helps solidify this idea for me. So if I was designing an intelligence community, I would want my analysts to be area experts. I would want them to spend their lives learning language, learning the people, learning the history, learning all about a country and how it operates, and really developing this rich, deep understanding of that. And that's what I would want to be that's who I would want being the analysts who are looking at current events and giving me intel. That's not how analysts operate in the US intelligence community. Because if you spend your career as an analyst, you're very quickly going to max out in the government pay grades. You just will, and you won't be able to get a raise, and you won't be able to afford a house in the DC area, and you won't be able to send your kids to a nice school, and you won't be able to take vacations. And as a result, folks who are working within that sort of pay structure are looking around at what it's going to take to get that next raise. And that probably means moving out of being an analyst and into management. But management doesn't want to hire just analysts. Management wants to hire somebody who can be a manager at any part of the organization. And so the way to jump into management is to not spend your career being an analyst. It's to spend your career doing a few years as an analyst, a few years in the field, a few years in HR, a few years in media relations, and doing a bunch of different jobs for a couple years so that you can sort of jump up into that management tier and be effective that way. And so the organization creates all these incentives for people to do things that maybe aren't what I would want if I was the leader and I was designing the system, people to be doing to get the optimum result for me. But they're doing what makes sense for them to get the optimum result for them. I think it's also worth flagging that the bureaucrats do have their own agendas. They have a very oftentimes nuanced and detailed understanding of the situation that they're working in. They see the complexity in ways that people at the top don't, and they may be vested in particular policy outcomes. Sometimes that can mean that bureaucrats will drag their feet, that forms won't get filed, and occasionally they just won't do what they're told. And I'll give you an example of this. After September 11th, when the United States was setting up the prison camp at Guantanamo Bay, the commander of the camp at the time was told to prepare Guantanamo Bay for prisoners. And so the commander, went to the shelf and pulled down the Army manual about how to set up prison camps, and gets to page, 98 or whatever that says, call up the International Committee of the Red Cross, and thinks, wait a second, that might sort of be a public relations issue. Maybe I should check in with the Department of Defense and see how they want to handle that. And so the commander of the camp calls up the Secretary of Defense and says, I'd like to bring the International Committee for the Red Cross in to inspect the facilities. And Donald Rumsfeld says, no, absolutely not. We're not going to have the Red Cross in there. They don't have the right. This is not going to be operating under the Geneva Conventions. The commander of the camp sort of said, okay, I understand, hangs up the phone, calls up the International Committee for the Red Cross and says, how's next Thursday look for you? The commander opted to follow the rules that were in place, opted to follow the structure that was in place rather than the orders that were coming down from a subordinate or from a superior. There are consequences when that happens, right? I mean, commanders can be fired and moved around. Employees can be sanctioned, but we shouldn't assume that bureaucrats are just automatons, that they're machines. And they also have power to influence policy in much more subtle ways. So bureaucracies essentially control the flow of information up to a president. The presidents access the world through the documents that are prepared by bureaucracies, whether that's the president's daily brief that gets provided every day by the intelligence community to the president, or whether that's just reports that are coming up about what's happening on the ground or possible policy options. And bureaucracies have a lot of power in terms of crafting different options. And so there's sort of a joke during the Cold War that the State Department, whenever the president would press for policy options, the State Department would respond with three options. And sort of option one was capitulation to the Soviet Union. Option two was thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union. And option three was the preferred State Department option, right? And so the joke being that the State Department provides the president what the State Department wants and sort of doesn't provide other viable alternatives, that the other alternatives are, going to be dismissed out of hand. So bureaucracies have a lot of power to shape even how presidents react with them. And again, it's worth keeping that in mind when thinking about policy. And then lastly, it's worth thinking about how a whole bunch of different things can sort of interact in a way that creates a real inertia. And sometimes in the foreign policy world, you'll hear this phrase of the blob, that there's all these different actors that have just sort of coalesced around a certain way of doing things and a certain way of thinking about the United States and its role in the world. And it's just really hard to move that kind of structure and system out of the sort of inertia that it's in. This has been around in the social sciences for a long time, this idea, and it's been talked about as sort of this iron triangle kind of concept where you have sort of an interplay between Congress and a bureaucracy and interest groups. And sort of the classic example, although there's lots of iron triangles out there, but the classic example is the military industrial complex. And so one way to kind of think about this is to work through the different actors. And so if you're Congress, you need funding for reelection. You need projects that you can tout to the public, whether you opened a new factory or there's a new base that's coming online, something for your district. And so Congress wants things from the bureaucracy. It wants things from interest groups, cash, and the bureaucracy wants things from Congress and from interest groups as well. And so if you're a bureaucracy, you need funding from Congress. You need to make sure that your appropriations bill is going to sail through and that you're going to have money for raises and new office buildings and all that nice stuff. But you also want to make sure that you have a place to retire to. And so if you're a military officer and you do a career in the military, when you retire, are there consulting gigs or private contracting gigs that you can go into that will pay a nice a salary for retirement. And so bureaucracies have incentives to play nicely with Congress and to play nicely with the interest groups that maybe they're regulating, maybe they're contracting with, maybe they're supposed to be overseeing. And so interest groups, want that favorable relationship with bureaucracies as well. They want that favorable relationship in which they get favors and priority contracts and favorable regulation from the bureaucracy. And they also want Congress to pass legislation and fund priorities that they are supportive of. And so because all these different actors kind of want something from each other, they have sort of this built-in incentive to play nice with each other and maintain the status quo. And so when that kind of a dynamic sets in, it can be really hard for a state to sort of shift course because of the sort of vested interests in what's happening.